What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to have a conversation about brand new maps versus remade maps or remastered maps. And the reason this topic is coming up is Dexerto did an interview with Jeff Smith as well as Joe Secott, and there's just a couple little quotes here as well as a tease that we should be expecting a remade map that the CDL players apparently played on last year and they enjoyed, that will be coming pretty soon. So I take that as likely at some point throughout Season 4, whether that's at launch or with the Season 4 Reloaded updates. Although that technically hasn't been confirmed, that's just the way I interpret that. And a little bit later in the interview, there is a quote from Jeff Smith here, just talking about new maps versus original maps. And with this quote, he says, "Even when we do new maps, people will say, oh, I didn't like this other map was way better." And he goes on to say, it feels almost like it takes some time to get used to something new, then suddenly 2 years later, they're like, oh man, Hackney Yard was a great map, but during the launch, you're like, that was a piece of crap. And then he says, you build those memories with your friends, and eventually you have these rose-tinted glasses of these maps. And when it comes to that, I do think Hackney Yard was a bit of a strange example there, because back when Modern Warfare 2019 launched, Hackney Yard and Gunrunner were touted as like the only two maps that were actually decent for 6v6, at least according to a large portion of the core community. But I definitely do understand what they're talking about, where it is kind of hard to win, where when you bring brand new maps in, people will say these aren't as good as the old maps, bring back more old maps. But then when you bring back too many old maps, then you have another group of people saying, why are you doing so many remakes? Why aren't you doing anything new? You're just lazy. And Joe Secott reinforced this a little bit, basically by saying they didn't want to rely on old staples from top to bottom, and they did want to establish a new stable of maps above all. And then he also said, it's really important we're bringing something new, we're evolving, we're making new content, it's a new game, and it's not just a bunch of remastered maps. So that's really why I wanted to get into this topic. I do definitely see what they're talking about here. I feel like it is a no-win situation. No matter which direction they go, people are going to complain. And that's largely just due to the fact that you have such a big fractured community, where when you make one side of the community happy, you're going to make the other side unhappy. Having said that though, I do feel like there are ways that they could mitigate this to some degree, and I just wanted to share my personal thoughts on this, just speaking from my perspective. I'm not trying to speak for the community or anything here, I'm just speaking for myself. And diving right in, I feel like the first problem here is the lack of consistency. I feel like expectations are often all over the place because we really don't know what to expect. Like with Season 4 coming out in presumably less than a month, I have no idea not only how many 6v6 maps we're going to be getting, I also don't know how many of those will be remade or brand new maps. Are they all going to be brand new? Are there going to be two remade ones? We never really know, and it's all over the place. Like Season 1 came with just 2 remade maps and no originals whatsoever. Then when Season 2 launched, we got another remade map with Dome right at launch, and then we got Velder's Museum, which is a new map to Modern Warfare 2, but it was a map that was fully expected to be there at launch because it was playable in the beta, but apparently there were some legal issues that prevented them from bringing those at launch, so it didn't really feel like a brand new map. It wasn't a map that we'd never played before. And then with the Season 2 Reloaded update on March 15th, this was the first time we saw a brand new original post-launch map that we've never played before with Himmelmatt Expo. So as we can see, they were all over the place when it came to their release schedule for new maps versus remade maps, and it seems like they really front-loaded with remade maps, which created a lot of frustration and confusion in the community. And I feel like they could cut down on some of these negative comments if there were at least some consistency here, where they combine remasters with new maps, and they keep a fairly consistent ratio. So just as an example, recently with 6v6, we typically expect 3 multiplayer maps. If they just kept it so every single season we get 2 new maps and 1 remastered map, and they didn't deviate from that at all, I don't think you'd see nearly as many complaints about this, because people would know exactly what to expect season after season. The second issue I've noticed is when they do remake maps, it seems like they keep remaking a lot of the same maps over and over again, instead of choosing maps that have never been remade before. So instead of bringing Dome back, or in the case of Treyarch, like Hijacked, they brought that back several times, or Standoff. I guess Treyarch's actually a little bit more of the bigger offender here compared to Infinity Ward, with bringing back the same maps over and over again. We've also got like Firing Range and Summit. Those have appeared multiple times as remastered maps, and while they're great maps and I really enjoy them and I see why they want to bring them back, there are plenty of other great original maps from way back in the day, like Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare 3, that I feel like would be excellent additions and would really hit on that nostalgia, but instead we get Shipment again, and we get Dome again. So I think that's another at least small area where some of these complaints are coming from, where some people do really want remastered maps, but they don't want the same remastered maps that they just got a few years ago. After that, another problem I've noticed with this situation is oftentimes these new maps just don't seem to hold up. They don't seem to have that same magic. And while I will admit, part of it is probably that rose-tinted glasses that Jeff Smith was talking about earlier. I'm sure that does apply to some degree. And I think another part of this as well is the core gameplay design of the modern games compared to the older ones. That can really affect the player's impression of the map, where maybe if they don't like the gameplay design as much, they won't like the map design as much. Whereas if that same map came to an older COD back in the day, maybe they would have enjoyed it more. Even with those factors in mind, I still feel like a lot of the new map design philosophies, especially with Infinity Ward, they just seem to be missing a lot of that foundation and that core balance that many of the old maps had. It's like they had that winning formula back in the day, and they've just strayed really far away from that. I don't know if that's just for the sake of innovation and trying to do something different, so they don't have really samey map designs game after game after game. But when you've got that winning formula, sometimes it's best to stick to it, and I do feel like they often stray too far away from that winning formula. Something Infinity Ward tends to do, especially in recent years, is it seems like they really like modeling off real-life locations. And while it's kind of cool that you can play on Piccadilly, or you can pick that scene from Sicario on the border crossing and it looks really cool and immersive, at the end of the day, I kind of feel like that limits how the maps will actually play, because they're not really designed from the ground up to be in a game, and instead it seems like the setting and keeping it looking true to real life comes first, and then they try to squeeze the gameplay design into that, and it just doesn't seem to work as well as if you took the opposite approach, where you build it for the gameplay design first, and then you model the theme and the setting to perhaps draw from a real life environment. And in a similar vein, something else that they did that I noticed is like with Black Gold, for instance, that came with Season 3. This was one of the few brand new maps that we've got post-launch for Modern Warfare 2, and while I think the map design is actually great, unfortunately, it's an NVG-only map. And while NVG can be neat, it plays vastly different from the regular 6v6 core experience, and this is why you often see a ton of people backing out the moment Black Gold pops up. I think it's because they tried to sort of squeeze in this totally different experience with this one particular map into the regular playlists, where many people don't want to play that, and many people feel that should be in its own separate mode, and there should also be a daytime version of this. So I think that's another area where some of the backlash comes from. When they add a map like that, it doesn't really feel like it fits in the standard map pool for 6v6, because it just feels like a separate mode entirely. And then one final point I wanted to touch on here is it really the maps that are bad, or is it the spawns? And with many of the maps in Modern Warfare 2, I do feel like it's the spawns more than the map design itself that is causing these maps to play poorly, at least for many people out there. Spawns can have a massive impact on how a map plays. You can take a great Call of Duty map, an absolute fan favorite, but if you screw up the spawn logic and the spawn design on it, it can play horrible. Additionally, I feel like many of the maps in Modern Warfare 2 really didn't seem to be designed with spawns in mind, and Embassy is always going to be my best example out of this. With Embassy, I actually quite like a lot of the engagements, and I like how the center of the map is laid out. However, at least in my opinion, I feel like they dropped the ball on providing proper areas for spawn relief, so that it's far more difficult to block off the primary spawn locations in the back that don't have a whole lot of room to breathe, and this causes a lot of mid-map inside the building spawns, and those spawns feel terrible because you don't feel a sense of direction and you don't feel a sense of any safety. It's very different from spawning on the back edge of the map, because when that happens, you know that your back is obviously safe because enemies can't be there, and therefore you only have to worry about what's in front of you. When you spawn in one of these middle buildings in Embassy, which happens quite frequently in my experience, now you don't know what's going on. You could be completely surrounded, and you often get that feeling of immediately being sandwiched the moment you spawn in, and that can make an otherwise solid map not play so well or not feel so great. And that's just one example. A couple other examples I have here would be like Himmelmatt Expo, for instance. I think overall the structure is really solid with this map, and again, I generally like how it plays. However, I do feel like there's that one big problem spawn right in this location here. This is one of the primary spawn locations that you're going to be seeing consistently throughout a match. At any given time, usually one of the teams is going to be spawning in this area, and when you spawn here, you have two choices. Go through an extremely narrow choke point where enemies have a potential height advantage looking down into that choke point and you have no cover pushing through there, or you have to backtrack away from the fight and really loop around in order to get back into the fight in a more favorable position. And that just feels wrong to me. Imagine if that primary spawn were more so back center, like we would typically expect with traditional spawn points in the game. At that point, if you're spawning there on a consistent basis, Now when you spawn there, you have several options to move out of your spawn, and you have so many equally viable choices available to you. So again, I do feel like a lot of the hatred towards many of the new maps is largely due to the spawn design rather than the map design itself, and many of these maps would actually play great with more traditional spawn system. So there we go, that's pretty much gonna wrap it up for the primary points I wanted to cover here when we're talking about the new maps that we've been seeing lately versus bringing back remade maps from older Call of Duty games. I do think it would be great to see a lot more consistency in the ratio between these, so we kind of know what to expect on a season-to-season basis. And then I also feel like perhaps some changes are in order to how they approach making new maps in the game, as well as the spawn systems that work with those maps. I think that accounts for a lot of the reasons that many people at least tend to prefer seeing those older maps return, beyond just the typical nostalgia and rose-tinted glasses. Now, of course, these are all just my thoughts and opinions on this situation, and I'd love to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, what would you like to see when it comes to a ratio of new maps versus old remade maps? And second, do you feel like new maps are actually worse these days compared to the maps that we would see in much older Call of Duty games? Or do you feel like most of that is just straight up nostalgia and that's about it? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.